Thank you, thank you. When I heard about this, I was really thrilled because I thought I was going to come up here and talk to a bunch of friends that I recognized. What the hell happened to all you guys? You got old, didn't we?
Yeah.
So, Jim asked me to do a little retrospective on my sordid history in Barbershop, and it's not that doesn't take that long. I grew up in a family born in 1940, and my dad was gone for 5 years, helping Admiral Halsey win the war in the Pacific. In the meantime, my role model was my granddad, who was an immigrant from Sweden. He was a carpenter, built an interesting little company. He met another guy when he was at Ellis Island, and they matriculated properly, and by the time they got to Minnesota, they had a little contracting company. And they built something that we saw today when we came through the Poche Tower. And they built the first steel skyscraper west of Chicago. Pretty interesting. He also, being fairly poor at the time, couldn't afford a violin but liked violin music, so he made his own violin. And my memory doesn't go back as far as the stories I heard, and that is that when I was literally in swaddling clothes, he would come home from work and put me at his feet and sit in his chair. He put on the RCA Victor Red Seal label, and Yasa Heifetz or Misha Elman or whomever the violin artist would be playing classical music, and he would be playing along with it. When I was 7, I wanted a bicycle for my birthday, and I got a violin. It was a little tiny one because I was a little tiny. But the interesting thing was that I could play it immediately, and I knew all the concertos. There is something to the whole business of don't hold a kid back and tell them they can't do things. So on the one side, I had a granddad that would take me to Northrop Auditorium every year to hear the great violinists. And after the concerts were over, he'd take me backstage and he'd introduce me to those great violinists. I had a dad who was an Irish tenor who loved to sing. And every year he would take me to Northrop Auditorium, and we would hear a parade of quartets sponsored by the Minneapolis chapter. So when I was 8 and 9 and 10, I was becoming a pretty good fiddler. I was also falling in love with harmony. And my granddad loved it because the violin artists that he taught me to loved melodies. That was what it was all about. Well, my dad came from a family of 5 boys. This guy over here, Jim, is my cousin. The 5 boys would get together with their extended families every year, and they'd have family gatherings, and the women would go into the kitchen to do whatever women did in those days, and the men would go in the parlor, or they'd go in the yard, and they would sing. And they sang what I later came to know as barbershop. Somebody would grab a melody, and the other guys would just put the harmony around it. And I grew up thinking that everybody sang. I grew up thinking that this was perfectly normal. Of course it wasn't. This group isn't normal. Well, I was destined to be a fiddler. But when I was 18 and heading off to the University of Minnesota, I had already spent years at McPhail Conservatory. And I was destined to be a concert violinist, probably first chair in some city orchestra. Because at 15, I was already the concert master of the Twin City Philharmonic Orchestra, which was a feeder to what today is called the Minnesota Orchestra. But then I had a car accident, and this arm got mashed up, and I lost the ability to finger. And that was the last time I played the violin.
How long ago was that?
Oh, that's 1959. So, the interesting thing is that I still could sing. And I had been a camp counselor with a fellow named Don Chalman. And I'd gone off to the military. I was a Marine, and I came back and went back to university. And one day I got a call out of the blue from Don Chalman. He said, "What are you doing tonight?" And I said, "I'm probably just studying for something." And he said, no, you're going to sing tonight." Now, you understand, I knew Don, and Don couldn't sing for sour apples. So I thought we were probably going to go out and play pool or drink or do something like that, but I thought it was a good idea, so I did. And he picked me up and he drove me down Lexington Avenue as far as he could go until we came to way the heck out of town near Shoreview. An empty lot. Had a couple, maybe a dozen cars or so in there, but it was a church that was going to be built. And you know how they build a church, and it's a basement first and that's it, and if they get enough money they'll put in the first floor and so on. We got there and it's cold, there's snow on the ground. We opened the door and the most glorious sound I'd ever heard in my life was coming up those stairs. And I thought, I'm in heaven. And we walked down the stairs and here were 16 guys. And in front of these 16 guys was a funny guy with horn-rimmed glasses named Fred Street. And Fred Street was a baritone, but he was directing that chorus and singing tenor because there were no tenors. He wasn't singing it very well. But then it didn't matter because those guys were just having a great time. And the guy says to me, a fella walks up to me, his name is Jack Skoog, and he said, you sung this before? And I said, not really. He said, well, can you sing really high? And I said, no. He said, can you sing really low? I said, no. He said, can you read music? Yeah, I can. He said, you're a baritone. And he put me over in the middle of the chorus in the front row, handed me a piece of music, and the guy next to me said, you sing the notes on the top of the bottom staff. Okay, so I did. That was the beginning of 60 years of extraordinary love of harmony. And gentlemen, you guys are part of the most amazing cult, I think, in history. Well, that was the little Roseville North Suburban chapter. And it wasn't very long before we were doing some things, and I had the opportunity to do a little radio program on Friday drive times, and I was trying to have a quartet, but there weren't any tenors in the chorus, and all of a sudden one night I'm back in a back room with two other guys, Don Chalman and his cousin Dale Torrey. And we're singing, and we have no tenor, but we're making a tenor sound, not knowing why, but it worked pretty well. And that evening, a tall drink of water came in. He was about 5'18" and weighed about 89 pounds. And he was from university. He was from Macalester or something like that. And he played a cornet, and he had some skills. And we put him in the baritone section, and he just read it like he'd written it. And we thought, gee, what a shame he's not a tenor. And we went in the back room, and we're singing, and we had coffee and whatever donuts or whatever somebody had. And Dale was well known for having a second or a third round of whatever the food was. And so he would take a break and go out and get some more coffee. And he came back and he said, you know that tall kid? Yeah. Well, he's out there standing with two other guys singing in a quartet. I said, two other guys singing in a quartet. How does that work, Dale? He said, well, he's singing one part and playing the other on the piano. Don says, I got to see this. He goes out there and he comes back, and this is the way I remember it. He says, his eyes are just like saucers. He says, you're not going to believe this. Yeah? He says, I went over there, and he said, that's exactly what was going on. He said, so I tapped this kid on the shoulder, and he turned around, and I said, you want to sing in a quartet? And the guy said, sure. So we're going to have a tenor. Well, Bob Dalma, when he got through with the other two guys, wore him out that night, came back, and that son of a gun could sing tenor. Not great, but it was, but it was pretty darn good. It was good enough so that it created the Night Howls. And for 28 years, the Night Howls sang all over the country and all over the world. The Night Howls were the guys that were responsible for setting up the first chapter in Sweden. And I'll give you that story quickly. I had been transferred, I'd worked for the phone company, I was transferred up to Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. And Detroit Lakes had no barbershop. And I would drive over to an hour to the dead west to go to Fargo Moorhead and sing with them, and I directed them a little while. And then one day I'm coming back and it's nighttime and it's about 2 in the morning because that's how we did it in those days. And I'm coming back and there's a blizzard going. Now up in northern Minnesota, this is black dirt territory where they grow potatoes and other things. And when the winter is cold up there and the wind starts blowing, it would blow snow across these fields and it would mix with the black dirt and it would turn absolutely black. And so what you had was a combination of snow and dirt. We called it snert. And snert was absolutely, you had no reflective quality whatsoever. So you didn't have a whiteout, you had a blackout. And I'm driving back and I'm having fun and I'm singing songs and driving my little Volkswagen at the time. And as I'm coming down, I'm trying to stay awake and I've got taillights of a big semi ahead of me, and I figure as long as I can see those taillights, I'm okay. And then all of a sudden, the taillights are gone. And I got headlights, and then they're gone. And I got headlights, and they're gone. I said, what? And I'm slowing down as fast as I can, and suddenly, I hit a drift across the highway. And it turns out that on one side of the road over here are pieces of the semi, and on this side of the road is the cab. And the driver is not a very happy camper, and he had hit this snowdrift that was probably 14 feet high. Whoa. And I'm sitting in my little Volkswagen because I hit it too, and I went ploop through it and stopped. And as I sat there and started to shake, I said, I'm not doing this again. Well, I took that guy home. He was pretty terrified. I took him home, he stayed with me that night, and he got on his way the next day. But the point of that story is, I didn't have any more barbershop to go to because I wasn't going to risk my life on that highway. So I made a pledge. I said, this town needs to have barbershop. There were 5,000 people in that town. That included men, women, children, dogs, cats, and anything else they had. And everybody I talked to said, you can't possibly start another organization. Everybody is already committed. They belong to the Elks and the Eagles and they belong to everything. And I said, but I need to have a quartet, so at least I'm going to get a quartet. So I made a pact and I said, I'm going to go build a chapter. And every lunch for 1 month, I would go knock on doors. And my whole approach was, do you know anybody that loves to sing? And everybody knew someone. 30 days later, I had 36 men signed. And I sent the application in to Kenosha, and they said, that's not possible. And they sent a field representative named Lloyd Steinkamp. And Lloyd came out and he said, we have to check this out because obviously this can't be true. Well, of course it was true, and that was the beginning of a long relationship with Stein Loincloth. Well, that was the beginning of that chapter, but the reason I gave you all this was one night we had a visitor to that chapter, and he didn't sing, he just sat in the back of the room. Nice looking young man, looked like he was about college age, and he wouldn't respond to anything. I would try to engage him and nothing. Finally I said, okay, does anybody know this guy back here? And one of my members stood up and he said, yeah, sure. He said, yes, my future son-in-law, you know. Really? It turns out that the fellow was from Stockholm, Sweden, and he had come over to ask for the hand in marriage of the daughter of the gentleman farmer who had sent his daughter back to Stockholm to go to the university and to find a proper husband. Wow. Well, that was interesting because not only was he able to sing, but he was a music major. And he loved Barbershop. And by the time, he missed his plane, by the way. He was supposed to go back the next day, but he didn't. But when he went back with most of my music. And for the next year, we communicated back and forth by little tiny quarter-inch tape mailers where he would send something and I would send something back, and I'd make critiques and I'd send it back to him, and I'd send him records. And that was the beginning of how the whole thing worked over in Sweden. So eventually, when we had a chance to really do something good, we put together a chorus of 80-some guys, and that chorus went all the way over to Stockholm, and a few other stops along the way, and that was the beginning of what we now know as the dynasty over in Stockholm. Over the years, I've had a chance to do some interesting business. I found out quickly in life that I couldn't work for anybody, and so I was self-employed, but I had a strange knack. And my knack was to be able to look at something and say, gosh, you know, if you painted that yellow, it would sell. Or if you did this to it, it would be more profitable. And I've had a private consulting business now all my life, and I've helped 26 companies, startup companies or turnaround companies, most of them be successful. 3 of them went public, some of them went in the tubes. A few made some really big money and some didn't. But all of that took me to 46 states. And in every single state, if there wasn't a barbershop chapter going, I found a way to make one. And if there was a chapter, I found a way to make it better. Because the principles that you use in making a business successful are no different. So I've had the glorious pleasure of helping start from scratch 6 chapters. I've helped 39 chapters turn around. I've personally recruited over 300 people into the society. I will tell you that it's simple. Recruiting is easy. Retention is tough. You have to be prepared for it. So I will say to you that it has been such a joy, because every place that I've had a chance to light, and we've lived in 11 states. We got out to, for example, out to Denver, Colorado. Actually, I went to Boulder. The little company that I was with was out in Boulder, and I was horny for a quart, and so I stopped into the Boulder chapter, and they had 19 guys. They just lost their director, and they were just in despair. And I said, well, this is interesting. Let's sing some tags. And we did. We had a wonderful time. And then I got shanghaied into directing the chorus. But I told them, and I did the honorable thing, guys. I lied. I told them 19 guys is not a chorus. That's just a very large quartet. Said if you want to have the optimum sound, you have to have at least 80 guys. Well, they said, well, we couldn't possibly do that. The biggest we've ever been is 24. And they'd been around for a couple decades. And I said, well, if you want me to direct, then you're going to have to build your chorus. And they said, we don't know how to do that. And I said, well, I can show you, but you have to do it. Well, 9 months later, we had almost 106 guys on the risers. Now, you'll find that there's a record with a vocal majority, that small group from down in Dallas. They've got a record that's out, and it talks about the concert they did in Denver. It wasn't in Denver. It was in Boulder. We brought them out there. I said, guys, you just came off your first show, your annual show, not the first show, but the annual show. They had $600 in the bank. And they just finished their show. And I said, you can't even pay my expenses. And they said, well, I don't know what we're going to do. I said, we're going to have a show. They said, we just had a show. I said, no. You just had a little event. You need a show. Why don't we put on a show that brings people in? Well, what do you mean? I said, well, you got to have a big act. Well, like what? I said, well, why don't you bring in a guest chorus? They said, we never heard of such a thing. I said, well, no. The reason you don't have any real barbershop in this area is because nobody's thought about having real barbershop. You're having a hobby. So I picked up the phone and I called a fella over in Dallas named Jim and said, we have a situation out here. Are you guys coming this direction anytime? And he said, as a matter of fact, and 3 months ahead, he said, we have a tour going on the West Coast. And he said, we're going to be out doing a couple different shows. He said, we'll be flying over Denver on Sunday. He said, if you could pay for the last leg of our flight, we'll stop. Excellent. So now, what do? The biggest auditorium in all of Denver had less than 1,000 seats. We couldn't cover the cost of the airplane for that. But the county had just built a new building at their fairgrounds. It was going to be for cattle, but right now it was empty, and it was big, and it would hold lots of people. And we got it donated. And we got tables donated, and we got chairs donated, and we got food donated, and we got everything donated, and we promoted, and we brought people in from 5 states. We filled the place, standing room only. Vocal majority came in, we picked them up, first class, picked them up with school buses, drove them from the airport out to Boulder, and out to the facility. They came in there, these guys were already exhausted, and they were so thrilled to be able to do another show. They just right now turned on, and there they were. And they had a couple of rummy quartets with them. And you know who the quartets were back in 1985 and 86 and 87. Pretty decent group. Well, they put on a show that will knock your socks off. And we did. We just did a fun little thing where our chorus got up and sang, did pretty well. Put 100 and some guys on the risers and did the best they could do. And then we took off our tuxes and put on our aprons, and we served the nachos and the food and the whatever, and it was grand time. Well, they made a lot of money. And then they said, wow, this is spectacular. I said, how about next year? I said, let's start planning right now for next year. They said, what? I said, well, there's an old friend named Jimmy Miller who has a group out there a little further to the east, and I said, they made the offer. We brought them out to St. Paul several times, and they made the offer anytime, just give us a call, we'll bring a show. And they said, well, what if it didn't work? I said, what do you mean? They said, well, you mean we're going to do this again? I said, well, yeah. Well, I don't think that's possible. And the board absolutely said, we're terrified. How could this work? And I said, you have a choice. You either think like champions or you don't. You either know your music or you don't. You either function as winners or you don't. I said, you don't have to do this, but if you want me to direct, that's what you have to do. And they said, we can't take the risk. And I said, goodbye. And I moved down a little further south into the Denver area, and I started another little chorus called the Denver Tech Chorus that became the Sound of the Rockies. And that, by the way, that was over 100 men. Didn't take very long. All of the guys that we had for the Sound of the Rockies, we started with 5 experienced barbershoppers. Everybody else was a new guy. How the heck did we get them? We talked to strangers. That's the secret, guys. Don't talk to people you know. They already know they don't like what you do. We talk to strangers. Well, things went well. Had lots of fun out there, and then all of a sudden, I got a call and said, would you be a keynote speaker for our convention down in Houston? I went down there and did it, and it was fun, and the company made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I stayed there. Had to call my poor wife and say, close up the business and the house and the whole thing, and come on down to Houston. I don't have time. I'm working Monday.
Steve?
Yep.
My apologies, I had to get Mark back to work.
Why don't you go to work?
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you, Mark. Sorry, buddy. And I'm going to wrap this up too. I'll tell you though that when I got back to Houston, the Houston Tidelanders that you've known, big chorus, Houston Tidelanders already had their music committee and their teams organized, and they really didn't need any help. At least that's what they said. So I looked around and I found a little fledgling chorus with about 9 people, and they had lost their director and their average age was deceased. And I said, hey, if you want to have some fun, well, anyway, we grew to 106 guys in about a year. This thing, Barbershop, is just all possibility thinking. And making things happen is kind of like woodshedding. You know, it all fits. You just have to find the spot. And if one doesn't work, do another one. Anyway, I want to give you one more thought. I've been retired a couple times now, and it doesn't seem to work well for me. And so I found a situation where we have a lot of groups in Houston that raise money every year for charity. It turns out I like to play golf. I used to. And it turns out that there are about 5,000 golf tournaments every year in Houston. 5,000. That sounded like opportunity to me. And I had played in a number of charity tournaments, and they were all boring. The same darn thing. Same velour towel that doesn't hold water. The same hat you don't need any more of. The same whatevers, okay? And I said, this doesn't make any sense. Anyway, I came up with some ideas that made it fun for charities doing golf, and we've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars with our little group of retired guys. And in the process, I wound up writing a book, Good Strokes for Older Folks. Has to do with golf, but it also has to do with barbershop. And all the profits from this go to help wounded warriors and other military guys that need help. I want to suggest it to you. If you, whether you're a golfer or not, if you know a golf nut, you owe it to yourselves to have a copy and to give them a copy. You get it easily on Amazon, and just go to hashtag Better Strokes. That'll get you there. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for coming today. This has just been a delight, and it's fun to see you old farts. It's just amazing. We are part of something that is extraordinary. I hope we can keep it going for our kids and our next generation. Thank you.
Yeah.